Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and John Nash Jr., the brilliant mathematician whose mind touched both sublime pattern and shattering chaos. Together and apart, they illuminate the trembling boundary between genius and madness, between the visions that create and the visions that destroy. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach the landscape where reason dissolves into unreason. One seeing madness as a sacred text written in the language of archetypes, the other experiencing it as invasive strangers speaking messages of conspiracy and persecution. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories where consciousness fragments. And the question becomes not whether the visions are real, but what they mean and how we might survive them whole. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most, the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Nash, as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. Let us begin in Switzerland, in the years just before the First World War would tear Europe apart and forever change the landscape of the human psyche. Carl Jung stood at a precipice of his own making. He had broken with Sigmund Freud, his mentor and father figure, rejecting the older man's insistence that sexuality lay at the root of all psychological disturbance. Jung sensed something deeper, older, more mythological, moving beneath the surface of the psyche. But the break cost him dearly. His professional reputation hung in the balance. His colleagues whispered that he had gone mad, and perhaps, in a way, he had. In the winter of 1913, Jung began to experience what he would later call a confrontation with the unconscious. Visions assailed him. Figures emerged from within his psyche with their own voices, their own demands, their own terrible autonomy. An old man appeared, calling himself Elijah, later transforming into the figure Jung named Philemon. This inner being seemed to possess knowledge Jung did not have, spoke wisdom Jung had not formulated. Jung walked with Philemon in his garden, conversed with him, learned from him as one learns from a teacher. To any observer, Jung was talking to empty air. To Jung himself, Philemon was utterly real, a messenger from the depths carrying truths about the structure of the soul. Jung did not collapse under these visions. Instead, he turned toward them with an explorer's curiosity and an artist's dedication. He began what would become his Red Book, that massive leather-bound volume illuminated with mandalas and mythological imagery, chronicling his descent into and return from the underworld of his own unconscious. He painted, he wrote in elaborate calligraphy. He engaged his visions as if they were sacred texts awaiting interpretation. He developed what he called active imagination, a technique of dialoguing with these inner figures, giving them space to speak while maintaining enough ego consciousness to record and reflect upon their messages. This period, which lasted several years, became the crucible from which Jung's entire mature psychology would emerge. From it came his concepts of archetypes, collective unconscious, individuation, and the self as the organizing center of the psyche. Jung came to understand his crisis not as pathology, but as initiation. The figures he encountered were not symptoms of disease, but personifications of psychological structures common to all humanity. They were, he believed, the same figures that appear in myths, fairy tales, and religious visions across cultures and centuries. His temporary madness was, in this view, a kind of shamanic journey, a death and rebirth that granted him access to deeper layers of meaning. Jung's work after this period consistently maintained that what we call madness often contains profound psychological and spiritual truth. The psychotic individual, Jung argued, is overwhelmed by archetypal material that erupts from the collective unconscious without adequate ego strength to contain and integrate it. The symbols, the visions, the voices are not meaningless distortions of reality, but meaningful communications from deeper layers of the psyche. The task is not merely to suppress them through medication or restraint, but to understand them, to translate their symbolic language, to find the thread of meaning that might lead the sufferer back to wholeness. This was Jung's framework, born from his own brush with what others might call psychosis. He emerged, not diminished, but enlarged, carrying a psychology that honored the wisdom hidden within madness. His Red Book remained unpublished during his lifetime, locked away as too personal, too strange, too revelatory. It would not see print until 2009, nearly 50 years after his death, when the world would finally witness the full extent of Jung's own confrontation with the abyss. Now let us turn to another mind, another time, another crisis. John Forbes Nash, Jr. was born on June 13, 1928, in Bluefield, West Virginia, into a world vastly different from Jung's Swiss Alps. His father was an electrical engineer, his mother a schoolteacher who had herself studied languages and Latin. Young Nash showed early signs of brilliance, but not in ways that endeared him to peers. He was solitary, awkward, absorbed in books and internal calculations. He preferred lone experimentation to social games, the world of mathematical patterns to the messy unpredictability of human relationships. Nash's genius flowered at the Carnegie Institute of Technology, now Carnegie Mellon, where he studied mathematics with such intensity and originality that his professors quickly recognized they were dealing with a mind of rare power. He went to Princeton for graduate work at age 20, arriving with a single-sentence letter of recommendation from his Carnegie professor, "This man is a genius." At Princeton, Nash moved among other brilliant mathematicians, but even there he stood apart, working on problems others considered impossibly difficult, approaching them with methods no one had quite seen before. In 1950, at just 21 years old, Nash completed his doctoral dissertation on game theory, a mere 27 pages that would eventually win him the Nobel Prize in Economics decades later. His Nash equilibrium revolutionized how we understand strategic decision-making in competitive situations, with applications spanning economics, biology, political science, and beyond. But Nash was just beginning. He moved into pure mathematics, tackling problems in differential geometry and partial differential equations, producing work of such elegance and power that he was widely regarded as one of the most promising mathematical minds of his generation. Nash seemed destined for a conventional trajectory of academic glory. He took a position at MIT. He published papers that stunned his colleagues with their originality. He married Alicia Larde, a physics student he met while teaching. He appeared to be building the life expected of a mathematical star: professor, research, recognition, a secure place in the intellectual establishment. But sometime in the late 1950s, something began to shift in Nash's mind. The exact chronology is difficult to establish because the beginning of psychosis rarely announces itself clearly. There are hints, odd behaviors, strange preoccupations that only later, in retrospect, arrange themselves into the pattern of emerging illness. Nash began to see hidden meanings in ordinary events. Numbers on license plates contained coded messages. Newspaper articles concealed cryptic communications directed specifically at him. Strangers on the street were not random pedestrians, but agents of a vast conspiracy. By 1959, Nash's delusions had crystallized into an elaborate system. He believed he was being recruited for secret government work, that he was receiving encrypted messages from foreign powers, that his mathematical abilities had made him a target for surveillance and manipulation. He began sending bizarre letters to government agencies and international organizations, communications that revealed a mind no longer anchored to consensus reality. His colleagues at MIT watched with growing alarm as this brilliant mathematician began to speak of cabals and conspiracies, of hidden patterns that only he could perceive, of a cosmic significance to his work that transcended ordinary academic achievement. The break came publicly at Columbia University, where Nash delivered a lecture that descended into incoherence, mathematical symbols giving way to messianic pronouncements about world government and cosmic order. Shortly afterward, Nash was committed to McLean Hospital, a psychiatric facility near Boston. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, a term that would follow him for the rest of his life like a shadow, defining him in the eyes of medical science and the public imagination. The next 3 decades of Nash's life were a wilderness of intermittent hospitalizations, forced treatments, insulin coma therapy, antipsychotic medications, and the slow erosion of the brilliant career he had been building. He and Alicia divorced, though she never fully withdrew her support. He wandered, sometimes literally walking the streets, a ghostly figure who had once commanded the respect of the mathematical world. His delusions persisted, sometimes diminishing, sometimes reasserting themselves with overwhelming force. The man who had revolutionized game theory became a cautionary tale about the fragility of even the most powerful minds. Yet Nash never entirely vanished. Even during his most acute psychotic episodes, there remained within him a kernel of the mathematician, the pattern seeker, the mind capable of perceiving structures invisible to others. And gradually, mysteriously, over the course of the 1980s and into the 1990s, Nash's delusions began to lose their grip. He did not recover in any simple sense. He learned, slowly and painfully, to recognize certain thoughts as symptoms rather than truths. He developed what he called a diet from delusions, consciously choosing not to feed certain patterns of thought, gradually rebuilding the capacity to distinguish inner voices from external reality. By the time Nash won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1994, he had become a figure of almost mythological resonance, the mad genius restored, the brilliant mind that had descended into chaos and somehow found its way back. His story was later dramatized in the film A Beautiful Mind, though that Hollywood version simplified and sentimentalized the complex reality of his experience. The real Nash remained marked by his long journey through psychosis, quieter, more reflective, carrying within him the memory of decades when his mind had been both his greatest gift and his cruelest tormentor. Nash died in 2015, along with his wife Alicia, in a taxi accident returning from the airport after receiving yet another mathematical prize. Their deaths came suddenly, without warning, cutting short what had become a kind of redemption story. But Nash left behind not only his mathematical contributions, but also the haunting question of what his experience meant, what relationship existed between his genius and his madness, whether the same mind that could perceive the Nash equilibrium was somehow structured in a way that made it vulnerable to perceiving conspiracies that did not exist. Here, then, are our two figures, Jung and Nash, separated by generation and geography and discipline, yet both marked by experiences that took them to the edge of madness and forced them to contend with a psyche that had ceased to obey the ordinary rules of rational consciousness. Jung's visions came in midlife, during a crisis of professional and personal identity. Nash's arrived in his early 30s, just as his career was ascending toward its peak. Jung interpreted his crisis through the lens of mythology and depth psychology, finding meaning in every symbol and figure that emerged. Nash's crisis was interpreted through the lens of biological psychiatry, understood as a disease of brain chemistry and neural misfiring, treated with medications and hospitalization. The question that hovers between them is this: were they experiencing fundamentally different phenomena, or were they experiencing the same phenomenon interpreted through radically different frameworks? When Jung spoke with Philemon in his garden, when Nash spoke with his hallucinated roommate Charles and Charles's niece, Marcie, were these the same kind of visitation? One met with symbolic curiosity, the other met with medical alarm? When Jung painted mandalas and recorded his visions in ornate calligraphy, when Nash filled notebooks with calculations that made sense only within his delusional system, were they both attempting to map a landscape beyond ordinary consciousness, one with the tools of artistic imagination, the other with the tools of mathematical logic twisted into service of unreason? To approach these questions, we must first understand the fundamental difference in how Jung and biological psychiatry understand what happens when the mind breaks. For Jung, psychosis represents an overwhelming eruption of archetypal material from the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious, in his framework, is a layer of the psyche deeper than personal experience, containing universal patterns of human experience, what Jung called archetypes: the hero, the shadow, the anima and animus, the wise old man, the great mother. These archetypes exist in all human psyches, expressing themselves in dreams, fantasies, myths, and religious symbolism. In a healthy psyche, they emerge gradually, mediated by a strong ego that can dialogue with them, integrate their wisdom, and maintain enough separation to function in the ordinary world. In psychosis, Jung argued, these archetypal forces burst through the boundaries of the ego like a river flooding its banks. The individual is suddenly confronted with figures, visions, and voices carrying tremendous numinous power. The very figures that in other cultures might appear as gods, demons, or spirits. Without adequate ego strength to contain and process these encounters, the individual becomes identified with them. A man believes he is Christ. A woman believes she is pursued by demons. Not metaphorically, but literally. The archetypal material has not been integrated into consciousness, but has instead overwhelmed and replaced ordinary ego consciousness. Jung's therapeutic approach to such states, when he had the opportunity to work with psychotic individuals, involved trying to establish some thread of communication with whatever ego consciousness remained. helping the person recognize the symbolic nature of their experiences, finding the mythological parallels that might give context and meaning to what they were enduring. He knew this was often impossible when someone was in acute psychosis, when the ego had been completely submerged. But he held that the content of psychotic experience was meaningful, that if one could survive and eventually reflect on such episodes, they contained information about the structure and dynamics of the psyche. The biological psychiatric model that dominated Nash's treatment operated from entirely different premises. Here, psychosis was understood as a breakdown of normal brain function, likely caused by disruptions in neurotransmitter systems, particularly dopamine. The content of delusions and hallucinations was regarded as essentially meaningless, the random noise of a malfunctioning biological system. Just as a broken television might produce distorted images that don't correspond to any actual broadcast, a brain affected by schizophrenia produces thoughts and perceptions that don't correspond to external reality and don't contain meaningful psychological information. Treatment, therefore, focused on correcting the biological dysfunction through medication, primarily antipsychotics that block dopamine receptors and reduce the intensity of psychotic symptoms. The goal was symptom reduction, the silencing of voices, the dissolution of delusions, the restoration of reality testing. If medications achieved this, the treatment was successful, regardless of whether the patient had any understanding of what their experiences meant or what psychological factors might have contributed to their vulnerability to psychosis. These two models are not merely different, they are incommensurable in important ways. Jung's approach requires that psychotic content be potentially meaningful. The biological approach assumes that psychotic content is essentially meaningless noise. Jung's method involves engagement, dialogue, interpretation. The biological method involves suppression, correction, a return to consensus reality without necessarily making sense of the deviation from it. Nash's experience was almost entirely shaped by the biological model. When he was hospitalized, he received insulin coma therapy, a brutal treatment involving inducing hypoglycemic comas, intended somehow to reset brain function. He received antipsychotic medications like Thorazine and later others, drugs that dulled his symptoms but also flattened his affect, slowed his thinking, created a kind of chemical fog between him and the intensity of his inner experience. He was diagnosed, categorized, treated as a case of paranoid schizophrenia, a disease entity defined by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. No one, as far as we know, ever sat with Nash and asked what his delusions meant. No one explored whether his hallucinated figures, Charles and Marcy, who seemed so real to him that he sought them for years after recognizing they were hallucinations, might be understood as projections of psychological needs or as symbolic communications from some deeper layer of his psyche. No one suggested that his conspiracy, theories, in which he was a figure of cosmic significance targeted by shadowy agencies, might be a distorted expression of genuine intuitions about his own importance, his genius unacknowledged in conventional terms, and so asserted in paranoid ones. Yet Nash's delusions, when we examine them closely, bear a striking resemblance to certain themes Jung identified as archetypal. Nash believed himself chosen for a special mission, tasked with decoding hidden messages that would affect the fate of nations. This is a classic hero myth structure. The ordinary individual called to an extraordinary destiny, granted special powers of perception that others lack. It is the structure of countless myths and religious narratives, Moses receiving the Ten Commandments, Muhammad receiving the Quran, shamans receiving visions that guide their tribes. Nash's delusion, from a Jungian perspective, could be understood as an inflation, an identification with the archetype of the hero or the prophet, in which the ego loses its boundaries and merges with a transpersonal pattern. In a traditional culture, such an experience might have been channeled into a recognized social role, Nash as seer or oracle, his visions given form through ritual and mythology. In modern secular culture, with no such containing structures, the experience remained private, unintegrated, marked as pathology. Similarly, Nash's hallucinated companions, Charles and Marcy, functioned as inner figures not unlike Jung's Philemon. They appeared with their own autonomy, spoke with their own voices, provided companionship and commentary on Nash's life. Charles, the imagined Princeton roommate, was a confidant, someone who understood Nash in ways others did not. Marcy, Charles's niece, evoked feelings of tenderness and protectiveness in Nash, feelings he struggled to access in his actual relationships. From a Jungian view, these figures could be understood as projections of split-off aspects of Nash's own psyche, the companion he needed but could not find in actual people, the innocent vulnerability he could not acknowledge in himself. Jung's own Philemon served a similar function but was approached entirely differently. Jung never believed Philemon existed as an external being. He recognized Philemon as an internal figure, a personification of wisdom from the unconscious. Yet Jung granted Philemon a certain reality within the psychic realm, dialogued with him, learned from him. Jung maintained enough ego consciousness to observe the relationship, to say, "This is a figure from my unconscious, and what he says matters." Nash could not maintain that observing distance. For him, Charles and Marcy were simply real until eventually, gradually, he learned they were not. But even then, he continued to experience them, could still see and hear them, had to actively remind himself they were hallucinations. Here we encounter one of the central questions in understanding these two men's experiences. What is the difference between Jung's active imagination, in which he deliberately engaged with inner figures, and Nash's hallucinations, which appeared unbidden and uncontrollable? Is it merely a matter of degree, of ego strength, of the capacity to maintain an observing consciousness? Or is there a qualitative difference, a different mechanism at work? Jung himself addressed this question, though without reference to Nash specifically. He distinguished between active imagination and hallucination based on the presence of ego consciousness. In active imagination, the ego remains aware that it is engaging in an imaginal process. I am speaking with Philemon, who is a figure from my unconscious. In hallucination, this awareness is absent. The hallucinated figure is experienced as simply real, external, not recognized as an internal phenomenon. Jung saw this distinction as crucial. Active imagination was a technique of consciousness expansion, a way of accessing unconscious material while maintaining ego integrity. Hallucination was a sign of ego dissolution, an involuntary overwhelm. Yet even this distinction becomes blurry when we examine Jung's own experience more closely. During his most intense periods of confrontation with the unconscious, Jung himself questioned whether he was going mad. The figures appeared to him with overwhelming vividness. He heard their voices. He felt their presence. At times, the boundary between active imagination and hallucination grew thin. What preserved him, he later believed, was his commitment to recording and interpreting the experiences, to treating them as psychological phenomena rather than external realities. But the phenomenological experience, the actual qualia of encountering these inner figures, may not have been so different from what Nash experienced. The critical difference, then, might not be in the experience itself, but in the framework brought to bear on it. Jung had a framework inherited from mythology, depth, psychology, and his own clinical experience, a framework that told him these figures could be engaged symbolically, that they carried meaning, that working with them could lead to psychological growth. Nash had no such framework. When his delusions began, he initially believed them literally. When treatment taught him to recognize them as false, he was given only the biological framework. Your brain is malfunctioning, these experiences are meaningless symptoms, take your medication, and they will diminish. Nash did, remarkably, develop his own framework eventually. In his gradual recovery, he learned to recognize certain types of thought as delusional, not through medication alone, but through a kind of cognitive discipline. He noticed patterns, certain kinds of ideas that didn't check out when he tried to verify them, certain internal experiences that didn't correlate with external confirmation. He taught himself to be suspicious of ideas that seemed to place him at the center of vast conspiracies, to recognize the signature of delusional thinking. This was, in its own way, a form of active imagination, a consciousness that could observe and evaluate its own contents rather than being entirely identified with them. But Nash never, as far as we know, asked what his delusions meant. He learned to recognize them as false, but not to read them as symbols. He did not interpret his conspiracy theories as expressions of his sense of special significance, his feeling of being watched as a projection of his own self-observation, his hallucinated companions as embodiments of psychological needs. The content remained, in his understanding, simply error, malfunction, noise. Would a Jungian approach have helped Nash? This is impossible to know, and we must be careful not to romanticize what would have been a genuine therapeutic intervention for what was, by all accounts, a devastating and dangerous condition. Nash at times believed his delusions so completely that he traveled to Europe attempting to renounce his American citizenship, tried to mail letters to foreign embassies, acted in ways that endangered his career and his family. His wife Alicia feared for their infant son's safety. The acute crisis required containment, required intervention to prevent Nash from destroying the foundations of his life. Yet we might still ask whether, in addition to biological treatment, in addition to the necessary reality testing and social support that eventually helped Nash, a symbolic approach might have offered something valuable. If Nash had been able to explore, in a safe, therapeutic setting, what his hallucinated companions represented, whether they embodied aspects of himself he could not otherwise acknowledge, if he had been helped to see his conspiracy theories as distorted expressions of genuine intuitions about his own significance and the competitive, sometimes hostile nature of academic life, if he had been given a language to speak about his experience that honored its subjective reality while not literalizing it, would such an approach have shortened his suffering or made it more bearable or allowed him to integrate something from the experience rather than simply suppressing it? Jung treated relatively few fully psychotic patients, and his success rate with them was limited. He acknowledged that active imagination required ego strength that psychotic individuals often lacked. His methods worked best with neurotics, people suffering from anxiety, depression, meaninglessness, people whose egos were intact enough to engage in the demanding work of symbolic interpretation. But Jung maintained that even psychotic experiences contained meaning, that the figures and narratives arising in psychosis were not arbitrary, but reflected deep patterns in the collective unconscious. One of Jung's most extensive writings on psychosis concerned a case from the literature. Not his own patient, but a paranoid schizophrenic woman whose elaborate, delusional system had been documented by other clinicians. Jung analyzed her delusions and found in them clear parallels to ancient mythological motifs, symbols of sun worship, rebirth, cosmic order, motifs the woman herself had no conscious knowledge of. Jung took this as evidence that her psychosis had activated archetypal material from the collective unconscious, that her delusions were not random but followed deep symbolic patterns shared across human cultures. Critics of Jung's approach argued that finding mythological parallels in psychotic content proved nothing about meaning. Anything can be made to seem meaningful if you search widely enough through mythology. The human mind is so pattern-hungry that we find significance in random noise, see faces in clouds, hear messages in static. Perhaps Jung's method was sophisticated pareidolia, finding elaborate interpretations for what was actually meaningless neurobiological noise. This criticism has force, but it misses something important about what Jung was doing. He was not primarily trying to prove that psychotic content was meaningful in some objective sense. He was offering a way of approaching such content that might be therapeutic, that might restore some connection between the shattered psyche and the world of meaning. If a psychotic individual could come to see their delusions as symbolic expressions of psychological truths rather than literal facts about external reality, they might regain some capacity to work with the experiences rather than being entirely overwhelmed by them. Consider Nash's conspiracy theories again. From a biological perspective, these were false beliefs generated by a malfunctioning brain, full stop. From a Jungian perspective, they might be seen as a kind of waking dream, a symbolic drama in which Nash's unconscious was trying to represent something true about his experience, his sense of being observed and judged by others, the competitive and sometimes cutthroat nature of his professional environment, his isolation and difficulty connecting with people, his sense that his brilliance set him apart and made him a target. None of this would make the conspiracies literally true, but it would grant them a kind of psychological truth, a truth about Nash's inner experience of the world, even if not about the world itself. If Nash had been able to understand his delusions in this symbolic way, he might have been able to work with them rather than simply struggling to suppress them. He might have been able to say, I am experiencing thoughts that reflect my sense of vulnerability and special significance. These are not accurate perceptions of external reality, but they tell me something about my psychological state. This is, in fact, something like what Nash eventually learned to do, but without a symbolic framework. He could only label such thoughts as symptoms to be ignored rather than messages to be interpreted. Jung's own recovery from his confrontation with the unconscious involved intensive interpretation. He did not merely suppress his visions. He engaged them, painted them, wrote about them, found their parallels in Gnosticism, alchemy, mythology. This interpretive work transformed his crisis from a descent into madness into what he called his most important scientific work, the empirical investigation of the unconscious through his own psyche. The visions became data. The inner figures became teachers. The experience of dissolution became a kind of initiation, necessary for the development of his mature psychology. Nash had no such interpretive framework, and no community that would have supported it. In the mid-20th century, Particularly in the hard sciences and mathematics where Nash worked, there was little room for symbolic thinking about psychological experience. The dominant framework was scientific materialism, mind as brain function, mental illness as brain disease. Moreover, Nash's temperament, brilliant in mathematical abstraction but difficult in human relationships, may have made him particularly unsuited to the kind of reflective, imaginative work Jung's approach required. Nash thought in equations and formal logic, not in symbols and myths. Yet there are hints that Nash sensed something was missing in the purely biological understanding of his experience. In later years, when he had gained some distance from his acute psychosis, Nash spoke about his recovery in terms that suggested something more complex than medication alone. He described learning to distrust certain types of thoughts, developing a kind of discipline in evaluating his own mental contents. He spoke of his delusions as having a certain emotional appeal, as seductive in their way, offering him a significance and purpose that ordinary life lacked. Giving them up was not merely a matter of recognizing they were false, but of choosing a less grandiose but more sustainable relationship with reality. This language resonates with something Jung wrote about inflation, the identification with archetypal roles. Jung argued that such inflation can be psychologically gratifying even when destructive. To feel oneself a prophet, a savior, a figure of cosmic significance, answers a deep hunger for meaning. But it comes at the cost of one's humanity, one's ability to live an ordinary life, to relate to other ordinary humans. The task, Jung believed, was not to suppress the archetype, but to find a right relationship with it, to acknowledge its power and wisdom while not inflating the ego with its transpersonal energy. Nash's gradual recovery could be understood in these Jungian terms. He learned to give up the inflation, the sense of cosmic significance his delusions granted him. He accepted a more modest understanding of himself, as a mathematician who had done important work but was not the center of vast conspiracies. Yet he retained something of his peculiar genius, his ability to see patterns others missed, though now confined to appropriate domains, mathematical problems rather than newspaper articles. He found a way to honor his gift without being destroyed by it. Throughout Nash's long struggle, one of the most poignant aspects was his relationship with his hallucinated figures, particularly Charles and Marcy. Even after Nash learned they were not real, he continued to see them. They would appear, Charles with some friendly comment, Marcy with her childlike presence, and Nash would have to consciously remind himself they were hallucinations, not actually there. He could not make them vanish through an act of will. They remained present in his perceptual field, but he learned to ignore them, to not respond, to turn his attention elsewhere. From a Jungian perspective, this is fascinating. These figures maintained their autonomous existence within Nash's psyche even after his ego consciousness recognized them as internal rather than external. They were, in a sense, split off. Parts of Nash's psyche that had achieved enough independence to manifest as perceptual realities. Jung would likely have been deeply interested in what these figures represented, what psychological functions they served. Why these particular figures and not others? What needs did they meet? What aspects of Nash's personality were they carrying? Charles, the roommate, suggests a need for companionship, for someone who understood and accepted Nash, despite his social awkwardness and intensity. Nash had few close friendships. His relationships with colleagues were competitive and sometimes hostile. Charles offered unconditional acceptance, someone who was simply there, reliably present. From a Jungian view, Charles might represent Nash's own capacity for friendship and connection, a capacity his ego had difficulty accessing in actual relationships, and so it was projected outward as an imagined other. Marcie, the young girl, suggests something even more poignant, a connection to innocence, playfulness, vulnerability. Nash was not known for these qualities. He was intense, driven, often insensitive to others' feelings. His relationship with his own young son was complicated. Marcie might represent the child within Nash himself, the part that needed care and protection, but that Nash's driven, ambitious ego could not acknowledge. By projecting this vulnerability onto an imagined child, Nash could feel tenderness and protectiveness that he struggled to feel toward himself or even toward his actual child. These are, of course, speculative interpretations, and Jung would have been the first to insist that valid interpretation must come through dialogue with the person themselves, not imposed from outside. But they suggest how a Jungian approach might have worked with Nash's experience, not dismissing the hallucinations as mere symptoms, but asking what psychological truth they embodied, what aspects of Nash they represented, what they might teach him about his own psyche, if approached with curiosity rather than simply rejected as disease products. Jung worked extensively with patients who experienced auditory hallucinations, voices that commented on their actions or commanded them. He often found that these voices, when engaged dialogically, revealed themselves as carriers of perspectives the patient's ego had rejected. The critical voice might represent internalized parental criticism that the patient had never processed consciously. The commanding voice might represent the patient's own will, projected outward because taking direct responsibility for their desires felt too threatening. By personifying these split-off contents, engaging them, understanding what they wanted and why they were speaking, patients could sometimes reintegrate them, robbing them of their autonomous, alien quality. Nash never had the opportunity to work with his hallucinations in this way. He was taught to regard them as simply false perceptions, glitches in his neural wiring, to be ignored or suppressed, and this approach did help him in practical terms. He learned to function, to return to mathematical work, to rebuild some semblance of a life, but one wonders what he might have discovered had someone helped him ask what Charles and Marcie were trying to tell him about himself, what needs they embodied, what parts of his psyche they represented. The contrast between Jung's approach and the approach Nash received highlights a fundamental tension in how we understand severe mental illness. Is psychosis primarily a biological disease, a malfunction to be corrected through medical intervention, or is it primarily a psychological crisis, a confrontation with unconscious material that requires interpretation and integration? The honest answer is probably both. But the two approaches have often been set in opposition, with biological psychiatry regarding symbolic interpretation as useless or even harmful, and depth psychology regarding purely biological treatment as suppressive and meaning-destroying. Jung himself recognized the importance of biological factors in psychosis. He knew that constitutional vulnerabilities, possibly inherited, made some individuals more susceptible to psychotic breaks. He knew that physical interventions, even crude ones, could sometimes help, but he insisted that even when biological factors were involved, the content of psychotic experience was not random, that psychological and spiritual dimensions could not be reduced to chemistry and neurons. Modern neuroscience has revealed much about the biological substrates of consciousness and psychosis. We know that schizophrenia involves alterations in multiple neurotransmitter systems, changes in brain structure, particularly in the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, disruptions in the connectivity between different brain regions. We know that antipsychotic medications, while imperfect and often carrying severe side effects, can reduce positive symptoms like hallucinations and delusions. These are real discoveries, genuine advances in understanding. But knowing the biological mechanisms does not answer the question of meaning. A brain scan might show us which regions are hyperactive during a hallucination, but it cannot tell us why the hallucination takes the particular form it does, why Nash saw Charles rather than some other figure, why his delusions centered on conspiracy rather than some other theme. For questions of meaning, we need psychological frameworks, symbolic interpretation, attention to the narrative structure of psychotic experience. Jung's model suggests that psychotic content, while triggered by biological vulnerabilities, draws on the collective unconscious, expressing itself through archetypal patterns. Nash's conspiracy theories followed archetypal patterns of the hero's journey, being chosen for a special mission, possessing secret knowledge, being pursued by enemies. His hallucinated companions followed archetypal patterns of the helpful guide and the innocent child. These patterns appear across cultures and centuries because they reflect fundamental structures of human psychology, templates through which we organize, experience, and construct meaning. If Jung is right that psychotic content follows archetypal patterns, then even when psychosis has biological causes, it still matters what form the psychosis takes, what stories it tells, what figures it conjures. These are not arbitrary. They reflect the individual's psychological situation, their unmet needs, their unlived possibilities, their relationship to the collective themes of human existence. And understanding these patterns might help in treatment, not replacing medication, but complementing it, helping the person make sense of what they endured and integrate it into their life narrative. Nash's recovery, which remains somewhat mysterious even to researchers who have studied him, involved both medication and something else, a gradual learning to recognize and resist delusional thinking. In his own description, it was like learning a new skill, developing metacognitive awareness of his own thought processes. He began to notice when his thinking was taking on the characteristic flavor of his delusions, when ideas were forming that carried that particular emotional signature of paranoid significance. He learned to be suspicious of such ideas, to check them against external reality, to remind himself they were likely products of his illness rather than genuine insights. This is remarkably close to what cognitive therapy teaches patients to do, to observe their own thoughts, to evaluate their validity, to develop skills in reality testing. But Nash seems to have developed these skills largely on his own, through years of struggle and reflection. What he describes is a kind of internal dialogue, a part of himself that could observe and evaluate the part generating delusions. In Jungian terms, this is the ego maintaining or regaining its observing function, its capacity to relate to unconscious contents without being overwhelmed by them. Jung spent much of his career teaching people how to develop this observing ego, this capacity to engage with unconscious material while maintaining consciousness. Active imagination was his primary technique. By deliberately dialoguing with inner figures, recording dreams, amplifying symbols through comparative study of mythology, individuals could strengthen ego consciousness while also expanding awareness of the unconscious. The goal was not to suppress the unconscious, but to develop a relationship with it, a kind of diplomacy between conscious and unconscious dimensions of the psyche. For Jung, this process was individuation, the central task of the second half of life. Individuation meant becoming more fully oneself, integrating shadow aspects, relating consciously to archetypal patterns, developing what Jung called the self, the organizing center of the psyche that transcends ego consciousness. People who completed this process did not become perfect or problem-free, but they achieved a kind of psychological wholeness, a capacity to contain and integrate the various contradictory aspects of their personalities. Nash's struggle could be seen as an involuntary, brutal version of individuation. He was forced to confront his shadow, the aspects of himself he had not acknowledged, his need for connection, his vulnerability, his hunger for significance. These emerged not in manageable doses through dreams and active imagination, but as overwhelming delusions and hallucinations. Without a framework for integration, he could only fight them, suppress them, learn to ignore them. But perhaps over time, even without explicit Jungian work, some integration occurred. Nash, in his later years, seemed more humble, more reflective, less grandiose than the brilliant but arrogant young mathematician he had been. Perhaps his long ordeal had changed him in ways that resembled, however painfully, the transformation Jung called individuation. There is something deeply moving about Nash's relationship with his hallucinations in his later years. He knew Charles was not real, but Charles remained present, visible, audible. Nash simply chose not to engage, turned his attention elsewhere, went on with his life, while these ghostly companions hovered at the edge of his perception. It suggests that the boundary between inner and outer, between psyche and world, had become permanently more permeable for Nash. He lived in a reality that included dimensions others did not perceive, but he had learned to navigate this expanded reality without being destroyed by it. Jung lived in a similar expanded reality. Throughout his life, after his confrontation with the unconscious, Jung experienced synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seemed to defy chance. He sensed presences, felt the numinous quality of certain places and moments. He took astrology seriously, engaged with the I Ching, explored alchemy as psychological wisdom. For Jung, the world was ensouled, animated by meaning, the boundary between psyche and world more fluid than scientific materialism allowed. Critics often accused Jung of being mystical, unscientific, but Jung maintained he was being empirical, reporting what he actually experienced and observed. Both Jung and Nash, then, lived in worlds different from consensus reality. Worlds where the veil between inner and outer was thin, where meaning and pattern appeared that others did not perceive. The difference was that Jung's expanded reality remained within his control, emerged in ways he could work with, while Nash's erupted chaotically, threatened to destroy him, required decades to manage. Jung had the tools of symbolic interpretation, the support of a culture that still maintained some connection to myth and religion, and perhaps constitutionally greater ego strength. Nash had mathematical brilliance, but no symbolic literacy, existed in a culture that regarded his experiences purely as pathology, and whatever constitutional vulnerability made him susceptible to psychosis. Yet both men made contributions that depended on their ability to perceive patterns others missed. Jung's entire psychology emerged from his confrontation with the unconscious, from his willingness to engage with experiences that others would have fled or suppressed. Nash's revolutionary insights in game theory and mathematics came from his capacity to see relationships and structures that had been invisible to other mathematicians. In both cases, the same qualities that led to their brilliance also made them vulnerable. The willingness to follow thoughts wherever they led, the comfort with ambiguity and complexity, the capacity for intense internal focus that could shade into isolation. This raises one of the most troubling and fascinating questions in the study of genius and madness. Is there an intrinsic connection between creative brilliance and psychological instability? Are the two linked not just coincidentally, but essentially, such that the same cognitive style that produces revolutionary insights also creates vulnerability to mental breakdown? Jung was ambivalent about this question. On one hand, he argued that neurosis and even psychosis could be meaningful, could contain the seeds of psychological and spiritual growth if approached correctly. He saw his own crisis as necessary, a kind of death that had to occur for rebirth into his mature work. On the other hand, he did not romanticize mental illness. He had seen too much real suffering in the patients at the Boghorsley Psychiatric Hospital where he worked early in his career. He knew the difference between a controlled exploration of the unconscious and being genuinely overwhelmed by it. Nash's story does not support simple romanticization of the link between genius and madness. His psychosis did not produce insights. It produced suffering, isolation, the destruction of his career and his family life. His mathematical genius existed before his breakdown and survived it, but was severely hindered by it. There is no evidence that his delusions contributed to his mathematical work, or that his recovery involved creative breakthroughs. If anything, his story suggests that genius and madness are tragic bedfellows, one enhancing life's possibilities while the other destroys them. Yet there may be a deeper connection visible from a Jungian perspective. Both genius and madness involve a departure from conventional thinking, a willingness or compulsion to see beyond ordinary categories, to perceive connections others miss. In genius, this capacity remains in service of the ego, directed toward problems that have consensus reality stakes, mathematical proofs, scientific discoveries, artistic creations. In madness, this capacity escapes ego control, perceives connections that have only private significance, constructs systems of meaning that do not correspond to shared reality. Nash's conspiracy theories were, in a sense, a kind of deranged game theory, perceiving the world as a vast strategic interaction in which every action by others was a move directed at him, requiring interpretation and countermoves. This is game theory run wild, applied to domains where it does not belong, hyperextended until it becomes paranoia. But the underlying cognitive move, seeing the world as a system of strategic interactions, was the same insight that made Nash's legitimate work revolutionary. Similarly, Nash's mathematical achievements often involve perceiving symmetries and equilibria that others had missed, finding the hidden structures in complex systems. His mind was pattern-hungry, skilled at detecting order. This same pattern detection run amok might generate the false patterns of delusion, seeing meaningful structures in random events, codes in license plates, conspiracies in coincidences. The difference between insight and delusion might be less about the cognitive mechanism and more about the domain and the capacity for reality testing. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious itself involves a kind of pattern perception that can seem, to skeptical observers, close to delusion. Jung claimed to perceive universal structures underlying all human psychology, archetypes that manifest across cultures and centuries. He found these patterns by comparing myths, dreams, religious symbols, art from radically different times and places. To Jung, the patterns were undeniable, evidence of a shared psychological substrate. To critics, Jung was seeing patterns that were not really there, projecting his own interpretive framework onto ambiguous material, the psychological equivalent of Nash seeing conspiracies in newspaper articles. The difference is that Jung's pattern perception remained testable against cultural and psychological data, remained connected to scholarship and clinical observation, remained in dialogue with other thinkers. Jung's interpretations could be disputed, alternatives could be proposed, evidence could be marshaled for or against. Nash's delusions, by contrast, were hermetically sealed, unfalsifiable, resistant to any evidence that contradicted them. When Jung claimed to find universal symbols, other scholars could examine the myths and art he referenced and argue whether his interpretations were valid. When Nash claimed foreign governments were sending him coded messages, there was no such public data to examine, only his private certainty. This suggests that what preserves the boundary between creative insight and madness is not the absence of unusual perceptions, but the capacity to submit those perceptions to some form of testing, whether empirical verification, logical consistency, or dialogue with a community of fellow inquirers. Jung maintained this capacity. He published, debated, revised his theories in response to criticism. Nash lost this capacity. His delusions became an echo chamber, every perception confirming the conspiracy, no contradictory evidence admitted. Interestingly, Nash's recovery involved regaining some capacity for testing his perceptions against external reality. He learned to be suspicious of ideas that others consistently denied, that could not be verified through normal channels. He developed heuristics, rules of thumb for distinguishing genuine insights from delusional ones. This was not perfect. He continued to experience the hallucinations, continued to generate some delusional ideas, but he regained enough reality testing to function, to live in the shared world even while still experiencing his private, expanded reality. Jung's active imagination technique, explicitly built in reality, testing through the maintenance of ego consciousness. The practitioner of active imagination engages the figures from the unconscious, but remains aware that this is an internal dialogue, a technique, a way of accessing unconscious contents. If someone loses that awareness, believes the inner figures are external spirits or demons, Jung would say they have moved from active imagination to psychosis. The boundary is the observing ego, the part of consciousness that can say, "This is an inner experience, meaningful but not literally true." Throughout his mature work, Jung emphasized this distinction, perhaps because he was so often accused of mysticism and irrationality. He insisted he was a scientist, an empiricist, studying the psyche through careful observation. The inner figures, the archetypes, the symbols were psychological realities, not metaphysical entities. They could be studied, their effects observed, their manifestations catalogued. Jung was not claiming that gods and demons exist externally, but that the psyche produces experiences of gods and demons, and these experiences are real psychological phenomena with predictable patterns. Nash's hallucinations were real psychological phenomena in exactly this sense. Charles and Marcy were real as psychological realities, figures produced by Nash's psyche with consistent characteristics, appearing regularly, evoking genuine emotions, What was false was their ontological status as external beings. From a Jungian view, the error was not that Nash experienced these figures, but that he located them in outer rather than inner space. The task of therapy would have been to help Nash recognize them as inner figures, as real as anything psychological is real, but not as external people. In practice, Nash's therapy did help him with this, but only in a limited way. He learned that Charles and Marcy were hallucinations, not real people. But he did not, as far as we know, learn to understand them as meaningful psychological figures, as carriers of split-off aspects of his personality. They remained simply errors, false perceptions, things to be ignored, the symbolic work Jung would have encouraged. Asking what these figures represented, dialoguing with them as inner presences, finding their meaning within his psychological economy, apparently never occurred. This is not to criticize Nash's doctors, who worked within the paradigm available to them and helped Nash achieve a functional recovery that was, by any measure, remarkable. But it is to suggest that something was lost, some potential integration that a more symbolic approach might have facilitated. Nash learned to live with his condition, but perhaps not to fully learn from it, to extract from his ordeal the psychological and spiritual insights that Jung believed were often hidden within mental suffering. Jung's own crisis, his confrontation with the unconscious during the years of writing the Red Book, was fundamentally similar in phenomenology to psychosis. Inner figures appeared with autonomous voices. Reality became strange, numinous, filled with symbolic significance. Jung heard prophecies, experienced visions of catastrophe, at times doubted his own sanity. But Jung emerged from this crisis with a wealth of material that became the foundation of his mature psychology. He integrated his experience, found meaning in it, transformed madness into method. The question is whether such integration is possible for everyone who experiences psychotic episodes, or whether it requires particular capacities, supports, and circumstances that Jung possessed, but many psychotic individuals, including Nash, do not. Jung had extensive education in mythology and religion, years of psychiatric training, a private practice that gave him autonomy, family and colleagues who supported him even while worried, and perhaps most importantly, a cultural context that still maintained some connection to symbolic thinking through Christianity and European high culture. Nash had none of these. He was a mathematician in the mid-20th century, trained in pure abstraction with no education in mythology, depth psychology, or symbolic interpretation. His cultural context was post-war America, secular, scientifically materialist, pragmatic. His colleagues had no framework for understanding his experience, except as disease. His illness cost him his job, his marriage, his reputation. He had to fight his way back to functionality largely alone, developing his own methods of managing his symptoms without the support of a community that could help him find meaning in his ordeal. Given these differences, it is perhaps remarkable that Nash achieved any recovery at all, much less the level of functioning he eventually attained. That he learned to recognize and resist his delusions without the tools of symbolic interpretation speaks to an extraordinary capacity for self-observation and self-discipline. Perhaps his mathematical training helped here. The same rigor he applied to proofs he eventually applied to evaluating his own thoughts, testing them for consistency and correspondence with external reality. Yet one cannot help but wonder what might have been possible if Nash had been offered a Jungian approach alongside or instead of purely biological treatment. If someone had worked with him to explore the meaning of Charles and Marcy, to understand his conspiracy theories as distorted expressions of psychological truths, to find the archetypal patterns in his delusions, would this have shortened his suffering? Would it have led to deeper integration? Or would it have been impossible, given the severity of his condition, perhaps even harmful by validating experiences that needed to be clearly labeled as false? These questions remain open because the experiment was never run. Nash received conventional biological psychiatric treatment and eventually developed his own way of managing his condition. We cannot know what a Jungian approach would have yielded, but the contrast between Jung's self-guided integration of his crisis and Nash's medication-managed suppression of his symptoms illuminates the deep tension between biological and psychological approaches to severe mental disturbance. Jung believed that psychosis, while dangerous and requiring containment, contained, meaning that could be excavated through symbolic work. The biological psychiatric view holds that psychotic content is essentially meaningless, the random output of a malfunctioning brain. These are not just different treatment approaches, but different philosophies of mind, different understandings of what consciousness is and what mental illness means. In Jung's view, consciousness is not simply the product of brain function, but something more mysterious, emerging from and always in dialogue with unconscious depths that carry ancestral wisdom, archetypal patterns, spiritual and psychological truths. Psychosis occurs when this dialogue breaks down catastrophically, when unconscious contents overwhelm consciousness, but the contents themselves remain meaningful, remain possible to work with and learn from if the person can survive the overwhelm and eventually reflect on it. In the biological psychiatric view, consciousness is brain function, nothing more and nothing less. Mental illness is brain malfunction, whether caused by genetic factors, neurodevelopmental abnormalities, neurotransmitter imbalances, or some combination. Psychotic content is epiphenomenal, the subjective experience of neural dysfunction, no more meaningful than the phantom limb pain of an amputee or the aura of a migraine. Treatment focuses on correcting the malfunction through medication, with psychological support helping the person cope with their illness, but not expecting to find deep meaning in the symptoms themselves. These two views need not be entirely incompatible. It is possible that psychosis has both biological causes and meaningful psychological content, that brain dysfunction can manifest through symbolic and archetypal patterns precisely because the brain, when it generates conscious experience, draws on deep structures of meaning, what Jung called the collective unconscious, what neuroscience might call default networks, and evolutionarily ancient subcortical systems. A breakdown in brain function might release these deeper patterns from executive control, allowing them to flood consciousness in overwhelming and distorted ways that nonetheless follow meaningful patterns. This synthesis would suggest that both medication and symbolic work might be valuable. Medication to reduce the overwhelming intensity and restore some executive function, symbolic work to help integrate the experience and extract whatever meaning it contains. Modern approaches to psychosis increasingly recognize the value of psychotherapy alongside medication, particularly cognitive behavioral therapy that helps people manage symptoms, and trauma-focused therapy that helps people process the often terrifying and disorienting experience of psychotic episodes. But even contemporary integrative approaches rarely include the kind of deep symbolic work Jung advocated, the careful examination of psychotic content for archetypal patterns, the interpretation of hallucinations and delusions as meaningful communications from the unconscious. This may be partly because such work requires specialized training and considerable time, resources that are scarce in contemporary mental health systems. But it may also reflect ongoing skepticism about whether psychotic content really is meaningful in the way Jung claimed. Nash's case does not resolve this debate, but it illuminates what is at stake. If psychotic content is meaningful, then Nash's decades of suffering represent not just a medical tragedy, but a lost opportunity for psychological and spiritual growth, an ordeal that could have been transformative if approached with the right framework. If psychotic content is merely symptomatic noise, then Nash's recovery through medication and self-developed reality testing represents the triumph of medical science over disease, saving a brilliant mind from being permanently destroyed by malfunction. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps Nash's delusions were both symptoms of brain dysfunction and meaningful expressions of psychological patterns, both errors to be corrected and symbols to be interpreted. Perhaps his recovery required both medication to reduce the biological overwhelm and the cognitive discipline he developed to recognize and resist delusional thinking. And perhaps something valuable was lost by not also engaging the symbolic dimension, not exploring what Charles and Marseille represented, not finding the mythological parallels to his conspiracy theories that might have helped him understand his experience as a dark initiation rather than simply an illness. Jung himself, reflecting on his own confrontation with the unconscious, always emphasized how close he came to being lost, how easily his exploration could have become genuine. Psychotic breakdown. What saved him, he believed, was his commitment to remaining an observer, to treating his visions as psychological phenomena, to be studied rather than realities, to be simply believed. But this required enormous strength of will, extensive psychological knowledge, and favorable circumstances. Jung acknowledged that not everyone in similar situations would have his resources or would emerge intact. The boundary between Jung's creative crisis and Nash's devastating psychosis may ultimately be less sharp than either biological psychiatry or Jungian psychology suggests. Both men experienced the ego overwhelmed by autonomous contents. Both encountered figures and narratives with numinous power. Both lived for years in realities others did not share. The differences were perhaps matters of degree, context, interpretation, and outcome, rather than fundamental differences in kind. Jung had enough ego strength, enough interpretive tools, enough support to ride out his crisis and emerge with insights. Nash's ego was more thoroughly shattered. His interpretive tools were inadequate to his experience. His support came mainly in the form of containment and medication. Jung integrated his experience and built a psychology from it. Nash survived his experience and learned to function despite it. Jung's journey became sacred, the shaman's death and return. Nash's journey was primarily medical, the patient's illness and recovery. Yet even this distinction may be too sharp. Nash's recovery, however we describe it, required a kind of wisdom, a learning to observe his own mind and distinguish truth from delusion. In his later years, Nash spoke with a reflectiveness, a humility, and a sense of having endured something that marked him forever, but had not destroyed him. These are qualities Jung associated with individuation, with the transformation that comes from successfully navigating psychological crisis. Perhaps Nash underwent a kind of individuation, despite having no Jungian framework for understanding it, forced integration through sheer necessity. In Jung's framework, Individuation is not something one chooses, but something one is called to, often through crisis, symptoms, depression, a sense that one's previous way of living no longer works. The psyche itself, Jung believed, pushes toward wholeness, and when the personality has become too one-sided, too identified with particular roles or values, the unconscious creates crisis to force change. Neurotic symptoms, depression, even psychotic episodes can be understood as the psyche's way of saying that something needs to change, that excluded parts of the personality need to be acknowledged and integrated. Nash's life before his breakdown was extraordinarily one-sided. He was all intellect, all ambition, all mathematical abstraction. His emotional life was impoverished. His relationships were poor. His sense of self depended entirely on his intellectual achievements. From a Jungian perspective, this is a setup for crisis. The excluded dimensions of life, relationship, feeling, vulnerability, exist not just in outer life, but as inner potentials, aspects of the psyche that demand expression. When excluded from conscious life, they don't disappear. They gather energy in the unconscious and eventually erupt in destructive ways. Nash's delusions and hallucinations can be understood as these erupting contents. Charles and Marseille, the imagined relationships, provided what his actual life lacked. The conspiracy theories granted him a cosmic significance that his professional success, however real, had not made emotionally meaningful to him. The secret messages he believed he was decoding represented a hunger for meaning beyond pure mathematics. All of this erupted in psychotic form because Nash had no conscious way of addressing these needs, no language for emotional or spiritual life, no practices for integrating his shadow and developing his feeling function. If Jung is right about this, then Nash's breakdown was not a random misfortune, a purely biological accident, but had a certain psychological necessity. His personality had become so imbalanced that crisis was inevitable. The form it took, psychosis rather than neurotic symptoms, may have reflected the severity of the imbalance and perhaps constitutional vulnerabilities. But the content of the psychosis reflected what was missing from his conscious life: relationship, meaning, emotional connection. Nash's recovery, then, involved not just managing symptoms, but, however unconsciously, beginning to address some of these imbalances. He had to accept limits, acknowledge vulnerability, depend on others, particularly Alicia, who took him back and supported him despite their divorce. He had to surrender his grandiose ambitions and accept a more modest life. He had to develop some emotional awareness, recognizing the signature of delusional thinking partly through its emotional quality. These changes represent movement toward what Jung called wholeness, even if Nash had no such framework for understanding them. This interpretation does not minimize the biological aspects of Nash's illness. It is entirely possible that Nash had genetic vulnerabilities, neurodevelopmental abnormalities, biochemical predispositions that made him susceptible to schizophrenia, regardless of his psychological situation. The biological and psychological dimensions are not mutually exclusive, but the psychological dimension offers something the purely biological view does not: a sense that even devastating illness can contain meaning, can be part of a life story that involves growth and transformation, not just victimhood and survival. Jung always insisted that he was not denying the reality of biological factors in mental illness, only that biological factors alone could not account for the specific form and content of psychological symptoms. Why does one person become depressed while another becomes manic? Why does one psychotic person believe they are Jesus while another believes they are being poisoned? Biology might explain the vulnerability to breakdown, but not the particular narrative that breakdown takes. For that, Jung insisted, we need psychological understanding, attention to the individual's life story, personality structure, and the symbolic content of their symptoms. Applying this to Nash, biological factors might explain why his mind became vulnerable to psychosis in his early 30s, a common age of onset for schizophrenia. But psychology helps explain why his psychosis took the form it did. Conspiracies and secret missions rather than religious messianism, hallucinated companions rather than threatening persecutors, mathematical codes rather than bodily delusions. Each of these choices, if we can call them that, reflects something about Nash's personality, his history, his particular psychological situation. The companionship theme suggests loneliness and unmet needs for connection. The conspiracy and secret mission theme suggests a need for significance and a sense that his actual achievements were not emotionally satisfying. The code-breaking theme represents his mathematical genius turned toward the wrong objects, pattern recognition disconnected from reality testing. Understanding these themes does not cure the illness, but it might help Nash and those around him make sense of his experience, see it as more than random brain noise, find the human meaning within the medical diagnosis. Jung's Red Book, published decades after his death, gives us unusual insight into what symbolic engagement with psychosis-like experiences looks like. Page after page of elaborate imagery, dialogues with inner figures, mythological narratives, all arising from Jung's confrontation with the unconscious. Reading it, one sees how seriously Jung took these experiences, how much work he invested in recording and interpreting them. The Red Book is not a diary of symptoms, but a sacred text, Jung's own gospel emerging from his descent into psychological hell. Nothing comparable exists for Nash. He left no record of the phenomenology of his delusions, no attempt to map the internal landscape of his psychotic experiences. We know about them only from external observations, psychiatric records, his later reflections, which were brief and matter-of-fact. This absence itself speaks to the difference between Jung's symbolic approach and Nash's medical experience. Jung's crisis was recorded, interpreted, transformed into knowledge. Nash's crisis was diagnosed, treated, managed. One became a sacred text, the other became a case history. Yet perhaps Nash's reticence about his experiences reflects something valuable. Jung's intensive self-examination sometimes seems self-indulgent, his elaborate interpretations perhaps reading too much meaning into what might be personal idiosyncrasy. Nash's pragmatic focus on learning to function, on getting back to mathematical work, on simply living despite his ongoing symptoms, represents a different kind of wisdom. Not every experience needs to be mined for deep meaning. Sometimes survival is enough. Sometimes learning to ignore the voices and carry on is the victory. This tension between finding meaning and simply coping is central to any consideration of Jung and Nash together. Jung's entire psychology is built on the assumption that symptoms have meaning, that working with them symbolically is the path to healing and growth. But this assumes a level of ego strength, cultural support, and life circumstances that not everyone possesses. For someone in acute psychosis, homeless, in and out of hospitals, barely surviving, Elaborate symbolic interpretation might be a luxury they cannot afford. Sometimes medication that suppresses symptoms, basic support for housing and food, simple reality testing skills are what is needed most. Nash existed between these extremes. He was not continuously hospitalized, not completely disabled. He had enough function, enough support from Alicia, and eventually some colleagues, to gradually build a life. But he also never had the opportunity to explore the symbolic dimension of his experiences, to ask whether his ordeal contained lessons, whether his delusions pointed towards psychological truths he needed to learn. He developed pragmatic coping skills, but perhaps not deep integration. If Jung's individuation and Nash's recovery are both, in different ways, transformations of personality through crisis, they represent different paths through similar territory. Jung's path emphasized interpretation, symbolic work, finding the mythological parallels and archetypal patterns that give meaning to suffering. Nash's path emphasized reality testing, cognitive discipline, learning to function despite ongoing symptoms. Jung emerged as a depth psychologist with a new system of thought. Nash emerged as a mathematician who had survived mental illness and could return to his work. Both paths have value. Jung's approach offers hope that suffering is not meaningless, that crisis can be transformative, that the psyche has its own wisdom even in madness. Nash's approach offers hope that illness can be managed, that function can be regained, that one can build a meaningful life even without fully understanding or integrating one's experiences. The two approaches are complementary, not contradictory. Different individuals in different circumstances will need different combinations of symbolic work and practical coping. Contemporary trauma therapy has begun to integrate these insights, recognizing that processing traumatic experiences symbolically and narratively can be healing, but that such work is only possible when people have sufficient stability and ego strength. There are phases of recovery. First, establish safety and basic functioning. Then, when ready, explore the meaning of the experience. Finally, integrate the experience into one's life narrative and move forward. Pushing for deep processing too early can re-traumatize and destabilize. Stopping at symptom management without ever processing meaning can leave people feeling their suffering was pointless, unintegrated, wasted. Nash's recovery seems to have stopped mostly at symptom management, which was itself a remarkable achievement. But one wonders whether, had he lived longer or been offered different resources, he might have moved into deeper processing of what his decades of psychosis meant, what he learned from living on the boundary between genius and madness, what wisdom might be extracted from his ordeal. His later interviews suggest some movement in this direction, a reflectiveness about his experience, but it remained limited, constrained perhaps by the culture he lived in, perhaps by his temperament, perhaps by lack of invitation or support for such exploration. Jung, by contrast, spent the last decades of his life interpreting his early crisis, publishing books that elaborated the insights gained during his Red Book period, teaching others to work with the unconscious. His entire mature work was an extended meditation on his confrontation with the unconscious. The crisis was not just something that happened to him, but became the center of his identity and work. This is profound integration, but it also raises questions. Did Jung become over-identified with his crisis? Did he generalize too much from his personal experience? Did his need to find meaning in his suffering lead him to impose interpretations that were not necessarily valid? These criticisms have been leveled at Jung by skeptics who see his psychology as too subjective, too dependent on his own unusual experiences, too quick to find archetypal patterns and cosmic significance where simpler explanations might suffice. Nash's more modest approach, learning to function without claiming profound insights from his illness, might seem healthier, less grandiose. Sometimes illness is just illness, not a sacred initiation or a call to wisdom, but simply a malfunction to be managed as best one can. Yet Jung's perspective offers something Nash's story, told without symbolic framework, cannot fully provide: consolation and meaning in the face of suffering. If psychosis is simply brain disease, then those who experience it are simply unlucky, victims of biological misfortune. If psychosis contains meaning, is part of the psyche's effort toward wholeness, even when that effort goes terribly wrong, then those who suffer it are not just victims but participants in a process that, however painful, connects to deep human patterns: the hero's descent into the underworld, the shaman's death and rebirth, the mystic's dark night of the soul. This meaning-making is not dishonest or purely consolatory. Jung believed he was observing real patterns, that psychotic content really does follow archetypal structures, that the figures and narratives appearing in madness really are the same ones appearing in myths and dreams. If he is right, then approaching psychosis symbolically is not imposing meaning where none exists, but recognizing meaning that is actually present, meaning that the biological framework is too narrow to perceive. The question of whether Jung was right cannot be definitively settled. The nature of symbolic interpretation is that it is not empirically testable in the way biological hypotheses are. We cannot prove that Nash's Charles represents his need for companionship or that his conspiracy theories follow the hero myth structure. These interpretations might be apt and insightful, or they might be fanciful projections, sophisticated forms of seeing what we want to see. Jung's defense was always empirical, but in a different sense than laboratory empiricism. Look at myths. Look at dreams. Look at psychotic content across many individuals, he argued, and you will see the patterns. Repeat. This is the empiricism of comparative study, of pattern recognition across large data sets, the same method anthropologists and literary scholars use. Nash's own work in mathematics involved exactly this kind of pattern recognition. His genius lay in perceiving abstract structures, symmetries, and equilibria that governed complex systems. He could see the underlying pattern that made sense of apparently chaotic interactions. This is remarkably similar to what Jung claimed to do with psychological material, perceiving the underlying archetypal structures that made sense of apparently chaotic symptoms and experiences. Both were pattern seekers. Both trusted their intuition about deep structures. Both achieved insights that others initially found difficult to accept. The difference is that Nash's mathematical patterns could be proven, translated into formal theorems, verified by others. Jung's psychological patterns remained more ambiguous, convincing to those who approached the material with similar sensitivity, unconvincing to those who demanded different kinds of proof. This difference reflects the fundamental distinction between mathematical and psychological knowledge, one domain allowing for formal proof, the other requiring interpretive insight. But perhaps the domains are not so separate. Nash's game theory revealed that even human interaction, seemingly the domain of psychology, could be described mathematically, reduced to equations and equilibria. Jung's archetypal psychology suggested that even the most personal experiences followed universal patterns, connected individual suffering to collective wisdom. Both were, in different ways, trying to find the invariant structures beneath the variable surface, Nash in strategic behavior, Jung in psychological experience. Their lives, then, can be seen as variations on a theme, two brilliant minds seeking pattern and order, both encountering the dissolution of pattern and madness, both finding ways to reconstruct order through their respective disciplines. Nash used mathematics and eventually cognitive discipline to restore his connection to reality. Jung used symbolic interpretation and active imagination to integrate his visions and build a psychology. Different tools, similar task, making sense of experiences that threaten to destroy sense-making itself. This is perhaps the deepest point of contact between them, the experience of consciousness fragmenting, the terror of losing the very capacity for coherent thought and perception that makes us human. Both men knew this terror intimately. Both survived it. Both found ways to think about it, to contain it within frameworks that restored some measure of meaning and control. And both left behind work that helps others understand these darkest regions of human experience. Jung's gift to those who suffer psychological crisis is the possibility of meaning, the suggestion that symptoms are communications, that the psyche in its wisdom creates even madness for reasons that can be understood. This is not always helpful, and it can be misused to romanticize or minimize genuine suffering. But for those who survive and seek to integrate their experiences, Jung's frameworks offer tools for making sense of what happened, for transforming traumatic memory into integrated narrative. Nash's gift, though he did not write about it explicitly, is the demonstration that recovery is possible, that even severe and prolonged psychosis need not be the end of a meaningful life, that brilliance can survive madness and even return to productive work. His story offers hope of a different kind than Jung's, not the hope of finding profound meaning, but the hope of simply continuing, of learning to live with symptoms, of regaining enough function to pursue one's work and maintain relationships. Both gifts are needed. Some who face mental crisis need meaning and symbolic interpretation to make sense of their ordeal. Others need pragmatic tools and hope for concrete recovery. Ideally, mental health care would offer both, honoring both the meaningfulness of psychological experience and the reality of biological factors, both the symbolic dimension and the practical dimension. Jung and Nash together represent these complementary needs. In the end, the dialogue between Jung and Nash, across their different times and contexts and experiences, illuminates the fundamental mystery of consciousness and its disorders. We still do not fully understand why minds break or what psychotic experiences really are. Are they purely biological malfunctions, or do they contain psychological and spiritual dimensions that matter? Is madness meaningful or meaningless? Do those who experience it have something to teach us about the nature of consciousness, or are they simply unfortunate victims of neural misfiring? Jung's work says that madness is meaningful, that it connects to the deepest structures of human psychology, that it can be understood symbolically and integrated. Nash's experience says that madness is devastating, that it can destroy lives, that managing it requires tremendous courage and pragmatic coping skills, and that those skills are hard-won and precious. Both truths coexist. Madness is both meaningful and devastating, both connected to deep psychological patterns and to biological vulnerabilities, both a potential path to transformation and a very real danger of destruction. The tension between these views need not be resolved but held, maintained as a creative dialogue. Modern psychiatry has sometimes swung too far toward pure biologism, treating all mental illness as brain disease requiring only medication. The pendulum may be swinging back toward recognition of psychological and social factors, trauma-informed care, psychotherapy alongside medication, attention to meaning and narrative. Jung's work is part of this correction, reminding us that the content of psychological symptoms matters, that symbolic work has value, that the psyche has its own wisdom even in disorder. But we must also honor what biological psychiatry has achieved, the medications that have helped millions of people manage symptoms that would otherwise be overwhelming, the research that has revealed the brain bases of consciousness and mental illness, the humane recognition that severe mental illness is not a moral failing or spiritual weakness, but a medical condition requiring treatment. Nash benefited from these advances, limited though they were in his time. Without antipsychotic medication, his recovery would likely have been impossible. The challenge for contemporary psychology and psychiatry is to integrate these perspectives, to develop approaches that honor both biological and psychological dimensions, that offer both medication and meaning-making, both symptom management and symbolic work. This integration is not easy because the underlying philosophies are so different. But in practice, with individual patients, it is possible to offer multi-layered care that addresses brain chemistry and psychological narrative, reduces symptoms and helps people find meaning. Jung himself, were he alive today, would likely embrace such integration. He always acknowledged biological factors, even if he emphasized psychological meaning. He would be fascinated by contemporary neuroscience, by what brain imaging reveals about the neural correlates of archetypal experiences. He might see in the default mode network, in the brain structures active during rest and daydreaming, the neural substrate of what he called the collective unconscious. He might find in the study of neuroplasticity confirmation of his belief that the psyche is self-organizing and capable of healing and transformation. Nash, for his part, might have appreciated a symbolic approach had it been offered in a way he could accept, grounded in structure and pattern rather than requiring emotional openness he found difficult. His mathematical mind could perhaps have engaged with archetypes as abstract structures, patterns repeating across psychological phenomena. Had someone helped him see the mathematical elegance in mythological patterns, the underlying symmetries in symbolic systems, he might have found a way into interpretive work that felt comfortable to him. But this is speculation. Imagining conversations that never occurred, therapeutic approaches that were not available. What we have is Jung's rich symbolic framework developed from his own crisis, and Nash's harrowing journey through psychosis managed primarily through medication and self-developed coping skills. Together they represent the range of human response to the experience of madness, from Jung's sacred journey to Nash's medical ordeal, and everything between. Perhaps the final lesson from considering these two lives together is that there is no single right way to approach severe mental disturbance, no one framework that captures its full reality. Psychosis is too complex, too multidimensional, too individual in its manifestations to be reduced to either biological disease or meaningful crisis. It is both and more. Each person who experiences it will need to find their own way through, drawing on whatever resources their culture, temperament, and circumstances provide. Jung found his way through symbolic work, active imagination, recording and interpreting his visions until they yielded their meaning and released him. Nash found his way through medication, reality testing, cognitive discipline, learning to ignore his persistent hallucinations and carry on. Others have found their way through spiritual practice, through supportive relationships, through creative work, through advocacy and activism, through 12-step programs, through silence and solitude, through laughter and refusal to take their symptoms too seriously. The multiplicity of paths suggests that psychosis itself is multiple, manifesting differently in different individuals, requiring different responses. What works for one may not work for another. Jung's approach might help some, but not others. Medication helps many, but not all. Reality is messier than any single theory can capture. This is frustrating for those who want clear answers, but liberating for those who have not been helped by standard approaches and need permission to try something different. What Jung and Nash together offer is permission for this multiplicity. Examples of two very different ways of living with and through the experience of consciousness, fragmenting and somehow finding or constructing a way back to function and meaning. Their lives bracket a range of possibilities, from full symbolic integration to pragmatic management without deep interpretation, and suggest that both have value, both are legitimate paths. In our contemporary moment, with increasing awareness of mental health challenges, increasing openness about psychiatric diagnosis, increasing efforts to reduce stigma, we need multiple models like the ones Jung and Nash embody. Some people find tremendous help in understanding their psychological struggles through Jung's lens of individuation and symbolic meaning. Others find more help in straightforward medical models and practical coping strategies. Most need some combination, adapted to their unique situation. The story of Jung and Nash together, then, is not a story of one approach being right and the other wrong, but a story of the vast range of human experience and response, the many ways consciousness can break, and the many ways people can survive and make sense of that breaking. It is a story of resilience and fragility, of genius and suffering, of the thin boundary between creativity and chaos that both men walked, and that we all, in smaller ways, navigate every day. As we come to the end of this long contemplation, let yourself rest with the mystery they embody, the mystery of consciousness itself, that most intimate and yet most strange phenomenon, more ourselves than anything else, and yet fundamentally opaque to us. Jung spent his career trying to map consciousness, to chart its depths and dimensions, to name its patterns and processes. Nash's consciousness produced revolutionary insights and then turned on him, generated visions he could not escape, forced him to learn humility and limits and the hard wisdom of survival. Both men remind us that consciousness is not simple, not reducible to neurons firing or to archetypal symbols, not entirely biological and not entirely psychological, but somehow both a mystery that we live within and that lives within us, creating our experience of the world and ourselves moment by moment, usually so transparent we forget it is there until something goes wrong, until the machinery of meaning-making breaks down and we suddenly see how contingent, how fragile, how strange this experience of being conscious really is. In that strange space of breakdown, both Jung and Nash met something that transformed them, something terrible and profound, something that could have destroyed them, but instead, through different paths, became part of the story of their lives, part of what they had to teach the rest of us. Jung teaches that breakdown can be breakthrough, that the symbols and figures arising in crisis carry wisdom, that consciousness fragments so it can reform at a higher level of integration. Nash teaches that breakdown is survival, that persistence matters more than meaning, that learning to function despite ongoing symptoms is a victory, that brilliant minds can endure terrible suffering and still contribute, still create, still live. These are not the same lesson, but they complement each other, like two sides of a coin or two paths up the same mountain seen from different approaches. Together they tell us something essential about what it means to be human, to be conscious, to be vulnerable to the very gift that makes us human. This capacity for reflection and meaning-making that can turn back on itself, create hells of delusion or paradises of insight, lose itself and find itself again in ways that defy simple understanding. Let these two lives stay with you, not as problems to be solved, but as stories to contemplate, as examples of the beautiful and terrible capacities of human consciousness, as companions for your own journey through the mysteries of mind and meaning. Let them remind you that when consciousness breaks, whether in yourself or someone you love, there are many ways through, many frameworks for understanding, many paths to recovery and integration. Let them give you permission to honor both the meaningfulness and the madness, both the symbolic depth and the biological reality, both the sacred and the medical dimensions of psychological suffering. And let yourself drift now. Let the questions and insights settle into the deeper layers of your own psyche, where they will work in their own way, in their own time, perhaps appearing later in dreams or sudden recognitions, perhaps simply changing subtly how you understand yourself and others, how you hold the mystery of consciousness and its fragilities. You have walked for a while with Jung and Nash, two guides through territories of mind that few of us wish to visit, but all of us, in our own ways, border on territories where reason gives way to something other, where self fragments and must somehow be reconstructed, where the boundary between inner and outer blurs, and we must learn again how to distinguish thought from world, vision from reality, meaning from delusion. Rest in the mystery. Rest in the not knowing. Rest in the spaces between their insights, where truth is multiple, where consciousness remains fundamentally strange, where healing comes in many forms, and meaning can be found, or made, or sometimes, wisely, set aside in favor of simple survival and the courage to continue. These men, so different, so similar, show us the range and depth of what human beings can endure and create, suffer and understand, lose and recover. They show us consciousness itself, in its terrible beauty and its beautiful terror, its capacity to soar and to shatter, to make sense and to lose sense, to be the ground of everything we are, and yet so mysterious, so fragile, so capable of transformation. Let their stories bless your sleep with the knowledge that consciousness, for all its vulnerabilities, is also remarkably resilient, that minds can break and reform, that meaning can be lost and found, that genius and madness, sanity and psychosis are not absolute opposites, but points on a continuum we all inhabit, that help comes in many forms and wisdom speaks in many languages, that both symbolic depth and practical coping have their place, that life continues even through devastating crisis, that recovery is possible even when it seems impossible, that stories like theirs, however painful, also carry hope. Welcome the darkness of sleep now. Let consciousness dim in its nightly small death, trusting as we all must that it will return in the morning, that dreams will do their mysterious work, that the unconscious will process what the conscious mind cannot fully hold, that rest will restore what contemplation has stirred up, that tomorrow will bring its own clarity, different from today's confusion and tonight's wondering. You have kept company with two extraordinary minds, two extraordinary sufferers, two extraordinary survivors. You have touched territories most of us fear, and all of us, at some level, know, carry their wisdom lightly, carry their suffering with respect, carry their resilience as encouragement, and let yourself rest now, knowing that the dialogue between Jung and Nash continues in minds like yours, in the ongoing effort to understand consciousness and madness, meaning and biology, the sacred and the scientific, the human being as both flesh and symbol, both brain and psyche, both machine and mystery, always more than we can capture in theories, always exceeding our frameworks, always worthy of the kind of deep attention and compassionate wondering you have offered tonight. Sleep well, wanderer. Dream deep. The journey through consciousness continues, for all of us, waking and sleeping, healthy and broken, making sense and losing sense and making it again, alone and together, seeking and finding and seeking again, and the pattern that Jung called individuation and Nash called recovery, and we might simply call being human, being conscious, being vulnerable and resilient, being the mystery that contemplates itself through lives like theirs and thoughts like yours, and the vast collective effort to understand this strange gift, this terrible blessing, this consciousness that makes us human and sometimes drives us mad and always calls us deeper into its own exploration of what it means to be aware, to think, to suffer, to endure, to mean. Rest now, the story is told. The dialogue continues in silence, in dreams, in the slow work of integration that happens below the threshold of awareness, in the place where Jung and Nash and you and all of us meet, in the collective unconscious, or the shared biology of human brains, or the simple fact of our common humanity, struggling with similar questions across different lives, different times, different circumstances, but united in this strange condition of being conscious, being able to reflect on consciousness, being vulnerable to its breaking and capable of its mending, being both the question and the answer, both the journey and the destination, both lost and found in the great mystery that holds us all. Welcome the mystery. Welcome the sleep. Welcome the dreams that come unbidden, like Nash's hallucinations or Jung's visions, meaningful or not, to be worked with or simply witnessed, to be integrated or managed, to transform us or to be survived, as each of us must find our own way, our own balance, our own peace, with the strange fact of being conscious in a world that both is and is not what consciousness makes of it. Good night, traveler. The exploration rests here, for now. Consciousness dims, and in the dimming, paradoxically, a kind of wisdom, the wisdom of letting go, of trusting the darkness, of allowing the psyche to do its work without the ego watching, of being held by whatever holds consciousness itself, that deeper ground that Jung called the self and neuroscience calls the brain and mystics call God, and we might simply call the source, the home, the place where consciousness arises and returns, every night in sleep, some day in death. The great mystery that surrounds our brief brightness and makes it precious. Sleep, dream, be held. The wisdom of Jung and Nash will settle where it needs to in your psyche, doing its work whether you wake, remembering, or forgetting, whether it changes you obviously or subtly, whether it provides answers or simply deepens questions. You have listened, you have contemplated, you have held space for their dialogue. That is enough, more than enough. The psyche will do the rest. Rest, just rest. Let consciousness soften, let boundaries blur, let the waking world recede. Let sleep take you down into that nightly mystery where we all, mad and sane, brilliant and ordinary, broken and whole, return to source, to silence, to the deep waters that hold all life, all mind, all meaning, all suffering, all recovery, all stories, all the many ways we try to make sense of this impossible gift of being aware, being here, being ourselves, being human, being conscious, being alive for this brief, strange journey from birth to death, with all its struggles and insights and terrors and graces woven together into the one vast mystery that we are and that holds us, and that we cannot finally understand, but can, moment by moment, choice by choice, witness by witness, learn to live with, learn to love, learn to hold lightly and with wonder. Good night, sweet dreams. May consciousness bless you in its breaking and its wholeness, in its clarity and its confusion, in all the ways it manifests in lives like Jung's and Nash's and yours and mine and everyone's, this great gift and burden we share, this mystery we are. Rest now. The dialogue continues in the silence. The exploration continues in dreams. Consciousness continues its eternal work of knowing and not knowing, making sense and unmaking and remaking, forever seeking, forever questioning, forever being itself, aware, 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 until awareness dims into sleep and sleep becomes dreams and dreams become the unconscious work that restores us for another day of consciousness, another round of seeking, another opportunity to wonder at the mystery. Jung and Nash both, in their different ways, gave their lives to understanding, to surviving, to illuminating for the rest of us. Sleep. Just sleep. The story is told. The wisdom is planted. The mystery deepens. And in the deepening, paradoxically, a kind of peace. The peace of accepting that some questions have many answers, that consciousness is larger than any theory, that both Jung's meaning and Nash's survival have their truth, that you need not choose between them but can hold both, can honor both, can learn from both. As you navigate your own consciousness, your own struggles, your own journey toward whatever wholeness or function or peace you can achieve, or simply toward another day, another moment, another breath in this strange condition of being aware. Good night, seeker. The light dims, the voice fades, the exploration settles. Consciousness releases into sleep. And in that release, everything that needs to be remembered will be remembered. Everything that needs to work will work. Everything that needs to heal will begin healing in its own way, in its own time, in the deep wisdom of the psyche that knows better than our conscious minds how to integrate, how to grow, how to survive, and even thrive after encountering these stories of breaking and making whole, these lives of Jung and Nash, these testimonies to the terrible beauty of human consciousness in all its capacities. Sleep deeply, dream well, be whole. The journey continues. Always and forever, the journey continues. Through consciousness and unconsciousness, meaning and survival, madness and sanity, the journey continues. And you are held, as they were held, as we all are held, in the great mystery that makes consciousness possible and holds it gently, holds it all, holds us all, in life and death, waking and sleep, understanding and confusion, healing and suffering, wholeness and fragmentation, the vast embrace that Jung tried to name and Nash tried to survive, and we all, in our way, are trying to trust, trying to rest in, trying to come home to. Home now, rest now, sleep now. The wandering ends for tonight. Tomorrow will bring its own journey, but now, only rest, only sleep, only the deep letting go that restores us, only the mystery holding us, only this moment of dimming consciousness, this small death we practice every night, this return to source. Good night, rest, peace, home.